Today I want to talk about obsidian. Why? Because it's a fascinating material, and because the way it's portrayed in video games often doesn't have that much in common with real life. It's always funny when video games treat obsidian like a metallic ore. You mine it, then smelt it in a furnace and forge it into a blade, sometimes an entire sword. In Icarus it's even funnier because even though the obsidian tools and weapons are made like metal ones, they have the characteristic pattern of real knapped obsidian. The developers clearly know how it works. It's even in the intro. So obviously this is just for gameplay purposes, to make the material fit into the existing crafting mechanics. It's magical too, doing fire damage and having a chance to directly melt ore you're mining. I love the look personally. Obsidian always looks great, and I like the purple tint of these. Very cool design, and that's what it's all about in most games. When you hear obsidian, this is probably what you're thinking of. This nice, glossy, deep black, glass-like material, right? But that's not the only form of obsidian. Sometimes it's more of a dull gray than a glossy black. It might be partially or mostly red, like this mahogany obsidian. The red color comes from iron oxide mineral inclusions, like hematite or magnetite. There are plenty of other variants like snowflake obsidian or rainbow obsidian. That's a particularly striking one. There are green types. There's so many different kinds of obsidian, some of which you might not recognize as such because, as I said, usually what people think of is this glossy black form of it. You know the mechanic in Minecraft where you let water run over lava and boom, obsidian? That wouldn't work quite the same in real life. If you just dumped a bucket of water onto lava, you wouldn't necessarily get obsidian. In fact, most likely not. Now, when lava runs into water, it can potentially form obsidian. You need a high silica content in lava, and it needs to cool rapidly, but not too rapidly, because if it's too quickly, then you might just have steam forming, or it might explode. There's a bunch of things that can happen, right? Because the point is, it needs to cool quickly enough that you don't have a crystalline structure forming. The atoms don't have time to form that. Because if you have a crystalline formation of the atoms, it turns into something else. It turns into a different kind of igneous rock, like basalt, for example, which is very different from this. So recreating this would be tricky, but there's plenty. In some areas you find quite a lot. And historically, in the Stone Age, they sometimes transported it across great distances to trade because, you know, the areas that didn't have it didn't have obsidian, or maybe not the same quality. They would want it from elsewhere. The way people used to make tools in the Stone Age is by flintknapping, or in this case just knapping because it's technically not flint. You've probably heard that term before. It's a little different than what they did later in Neolithic times, where they would grind the rocks. You would take some kind of rock and sandstone or sand on top of another rock, and you would just keep grinding it until you have that kind of shape. That's how you end up with those very smooth rock axes and other tools. And there's a greater variety of materials that work for that. Whereas this needs a particular kind of material. Flint, chert, obsidian. It needs to be glass-like in the way it fractures. By the way, even though obsidian is often called volcanic glass, it's significantly different from human-made glass. Now, both contain silica, just different amounts, and obsidian is actually not quite as hard as glass. So it tends to be a little less brittle, although you can actually knap glass as well. If you take the bottom of a glass bottle, for example, you can knap that and you can make arrow points, for example. Now, in some ways it's a little bit easier to work with because it's even more predictable, but I find it a little fragile compared to obsidian. What you see here, that's a flake scar. So that's basically the negative of the piece that you just removed. These ridges that are being left behind, you can actually use those to help control the direction of the flake. This is a piece like that where I used 2 ridges from flake scars to guide it, and this turned out quite nicely for a blade. As you can see, it's straight-ish, and it did leave some nice sharp edges here. So how do you go about shaping this stuff? Well, there's a number of tools, like other rocks. I have a few hammer stones here that I collected in different shapes and sizes. If I wanted to work with, say, this here, of course I'm not going to hit it with a big ass rock that's going to break it most likely. I would use something small like this, or I might use a soft percussive tool like this antler piece here. So antler baton is nice because this, since it's soft, it can kind of catch on the material a little better, catch and pull off the flake. Typically have to hit it harder with an antler baton compared to a hammer stone. And particularly with smaller pieces, you really don't want that, or as they get thinner, you might just end up breaking it. And speaking of breaking things, I don't have any finished pieces here right now. For one, I've never gotten advanced really at flint knapping. I have a bunch of practice pieces, and also, honestly, I tend to start things and not finish them. It's a bad habit. Not so much habit, it's more like I usually struggle to finish especially longer projects that require patience because that's not something I have much of. And in this case in particular, I have a bunch of pieces that I worked to a certain point, and then I was like, you know what? I'm not confident enough in my skills yet, and I'm afraid that I'm gonna break it, because I have broken a lot. Of course, it's part of the learning process. So, something like this, and particularly also here, I have some flaws that are difficult to fix. Like here, there's a step fracture. Let me see if I can show you some extra light. That right there. So whenever you have that, the problem is if I were to try to detach another flake from here, it would run into that and stop. And then the step would get even larger. So this kind of flaw keeps getting worse until eventually you have a real problem. I just want to show you as well with the light behind it. You can see a little bit. It's not quite thin enough to really fully shine through at the edge there a little bit. This is also where the mahogany obsidian is quite a bit different. It's not translucent, whereas if I take a fairly thick piece of the black glossy obsidian, you can see that it's much more translucent. Anyway, I need to stop getting sidetracked. This is something that I could spend hours talking about. It's quite fascinating. So, if I want to detach a flake from this piece right here, this is good because it already has a good angle here. Because you need the right kind of angle. In fact, a right angle is exactly what you don't want. So, here is an example of a right angle. You're like, this is just 90 degrees. You do not want to hit that. Right? I'll get back to that later. It needs to be less than 90 degrees. I'm going to put on a mask because the one thing you definitely do not want is silicosis. Let me tell you about that. So when you breathe in silica dust, the problem is it gets into your lungs, but your body cannot dissolve it. It can't break it down. So it stays there. And because it's a bunch of, hard, tiny, sharp fragments, microscopic sharp fragments, they can keep kind of tearing up your lung tissue. And then, as your lung tissue heals, it may scar over, and eventually your lungs are fucked up, in short, and then you can't breathe properly. So never breathe this in. Also goggles, because you don't want the stuff any more in your eyes than in your lungs. You always learn more from failure than success. So here is a piece where something went wrong. I wanted to detach a flake, a long flake that goes all the way, but instead I just got this. And the problem is with that now that it doesn't leave me with enough platform to take more off because I want to thin this out, right? So what do I do now? Well, I can come from this side instead of the top. Now I could just hit it like this. This is a very steep angle, obviously. That's where the antler comes in. I might be able to pull that off. So I have two main choices here. Either I can use the hammer stones to take off flakes in that direction so that I shift the angle, right? So if I remove this, then it's going to come down and the angle is not going to be as steep anymore. Or I can say, screw it, the steep angle is fine because this is a thick enough platform and I can hit it with this. And that's what I'm going to try right now. By the way, I would very much recommend using full-fingered gloves. I know how to hold it without getting flakes into my fingers. I find the protection for the palms more important, but generally, absolutely do use full-fingered ones. So I got to give it a good whack. And then you can see this flake here came off, and then these other two pieces fractured from it. And there you have it. Now this piece, this is just a junk piece because it's so strongly curved because of that bulge that I don't really have much of a use for it. But it did what I wanted to. It removed quite a bit here and thinned it out that way. And it ran all the way across. These ripples here I always find really pretty. It gives a piece a lot of character. Before I get too carried away, I'm just going to put this thing aside, otherwise the rest of the video will be just working on that. I just want to show you the principles. So in this case, when you use soft percussion, you use a steeper angle, whereas with the hammer stones, you generally have a larger platform that's closer to 90 degrees. Now here, if I look at this, this could be an axe, by the way, because it's quite thick, but for an axe blade, that's not really a problem. And I would like to do that, but again, I set this piece aside because I wasn't confident enough that I would pull this off without ruining it. Particularly also because this is kind of a tricky one, because you know, this platform here, this is way too close to 90 degrees. This is almost 90 degrees. So I don't want to hit that. Right? This, on the other hand, is very steep. I could do that with soft percussion, maybe. But I'm looking for a better spot here. Because the thing is, I want to make sure that the flakes run across the entire piece, or as close as possible. As often they're going to terminate before that, but I want to make them as long as possible. And I need a really good platform for that. Now, when you don't have good platforms, one thing you can do is just go around. So the way you see here, I could basically continue like hitting it here and then go back and forth in a zigzag pattern so that eventually I get a kind of an edge, kind of a thicker edge all the way around, and then I can use the soft percussion. Well, looking at this platform, that's a bit less than 90 degrees. It's somewhat risky, but I should be able to take some flakes off here to then prepare the platform to be less than 90 degrees this way. So I got to take the bigger piece off. I'm going to make sure that it's strong enough. Won't just crumble. Didn't run anywhere close to all the way, which is what I would have liked. But it's a decent enough flake. Right? And that's the principle. So the downside of this, well, not downside, just an inherent part of the process, is the fact that you lose quite a bit of width when doing this, right? Because as you try to thin it out or remove pieces, it also removes a bit from here, if I were to thin it out quite a bit, this whole thing would be probably this wide, depending on how thin I want to go. Okay, let's see if I can make it follow that. So I need to hit it right here. In the right place with the right amount of force at the right angle. That wasn't it. It followed it all right, but unfortunately it stopped short. Although, that's a nice blade actually, in and of itself. It's quite sharp on the sides here. Speaking of sharpness, let me demonstrate the edge of this flake here on some leather. So I want to cut that. No problem. It's a bit awkward to hold it at the same time, but you can see it cuts it just fine. The thing is, blades like this were basically disposable, because as this feather edge here starts to crumble or break off or get dull, you can't really sharpen it as such. I mean, you can't just grind it. You could try to grind it, but it wouldn't work that well on this. So instead, you would have to remove more flakes to thin it back down and make it that sharp. But of course, on such a small piece, there's nothing to work with. It's so thin that you can't really remove additional flakes without breaking it, right? So this you would just use for a while, and then when it gets dull, you throw it away. I want to show you a few other pieces I've worked on so you can see what's characteristic about this material and how you work with it. So here you can see there's a bunch of flake scars, right? Because I would go from the edge and remove flakes inward to try to thin it out, and this is fairly thin. It's not perfectly even. You know, like really experienced knappers can create remarkably even flat pieces. You could kind of cut with it. The very edge itself is not terribly sharp, but it's kind of like a saw blade. You know, like all these jagged parts there, you can kind of saw with that. On this side, I'm quite happy with how even the flake scars are overall. But as said, it's difficult to get them to run all the way across, or at least to the center. Because generally when you're making something like this, you can either go from one side and then try to make the flakes run all the way across, or you can try to get them as even as possible, all to terminate about in the center, and then you do the same from the other side. Both look nice. It's a different kind of appearance. Depends on what you prefer. Basically, the more experienced someone is, the more even everything is. You know, you can see here there's flake scars running in a bunch of different directions. You know, it's not like super smooth and everything. It's workable. Like, I could make a tool. It just wouldn't be the most aesthetically pleasing. It takes a long time. It takes years of frequent practice to really get good enough that you can make something that's really aesthetically pleasing. Here's kind of a mean piece with all kinds of challenges. Like for one, you can see it's all twisted, and it's got a curved edge on this side. This here is a mess. You know, that right there, that's, I don't know. Maybe someone could fix this. Maybe I could fix it by making something much smaller, but I don't know. This is kind of a lost cause. This one here kind of annoys me because it looks pretty good from the top, right? But then you flip it over and see what a mess it is. It's really thick. It's nice that it has the ridge there going in the center, but the problem is it's so thick that there's not really much you can do, because now with the way the surfaces are, you can't just take the ridge off. You know, you would just keep running flakes. In fact, this is what I did. I kept trying to thin it out, but then, you know, more and more they would kind of follow the same pattern and run into this top ridge, and then that's it. They can't really, well, you might be able to set it up so that it goes across and takes that off, but that's a little trickier. So the way this is, I don't know, there's not really too much you can do. I mean, I suppose it could be a spear point maybe. For a blade, it's just too steep. You know, this, like, I can't thin it down into a proper edge, right? Now, this would give it a lot of rigidity. So for a spear, that would work well. The only problem is then you have this fat end here that you have to mount somehow. I could try to remove some more there, but it's a little tricky. This here, you can still get some flakes off the top there. That's not so bad. But yeah, it's a bit of a frustrating piece. Ever since learning this, you know, to at least a beginner level, I have so much more respect for Stone Age tech. Because, like, you think, oh yeah, stone tools, primitive, whatever. But this is not a primitive art. This is actually quite advanced. You have to think ahead, you know, quite a few steps. You have to plan it out. You need a good amount of skill to do this. It's not a simple task. And finally, I wanted to show you kind of a modern take on it. You can get these obsidian slabs. These are cut with lapidary saws. And so the surface here, that's not what the actual obsidian looks like. Now, if I use some water, you can see it better. That just kind of cleans it up. But that's really just from the coarse grind that you get. And so you get these to make it easier, because then all you gotta do is at first you gotta go around, and I've started here. You've gotta go around to create an edge, you know, by alternating and removing a flake from this surface and that surface. You go around that way, and then you can start attacking it from the side and remove flakes across. Right, and what that looks like eventually is something like this. And I say something like this because, as you can see, I didn't manage to make the flakes run across the entire width. That would have been good. You can still do that. It's just going to be a thicker edge, you know. So, yeah, I didn't finish this either because I started to get frustrated with not being able to make them long enough. But again, this is basically usable as a kind of a saw. Oh, and the way you do that, this is not with either hard or soft percussion. This is done by pressure flaking. In this case, this is a copper nail, but historically they would use an antler tip. So you would push into it, you know, mostly in and a little bit down to pop off a flake. All right, so that's obsidian. Super cool material, looks amazing, interesting to work with. Generally a bit easier than other knappable materials. Depends a little bit on the exact composition. The glossy type tends to be easier to get flakes off, requires less force, whereas some kinds of flint, and especially chert, might be harder to work with. Some even require heat treatment, where you bury them and make a fire on top and then let it cool off. So the idea is that you heat them up and then let them gradually cool down, so then that they're a little bit more homogeneous and easier to get flakes off. Well, hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you think about obsidian. Thanks for watching, and take care, folks. And seriously, don't get these in your eye.